This is Thursday, September 19th, 2024. We are in Natick, Massachusetts, and this tape is part of the Morse Institute Library's continuing Veterans Oral History Project. My name is Maureen Sullivan, and we are privileged to have with us today Michael Barretti Sr. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
May I ask when you were born?
May 12th, 1945.
And where were you born?
New York City.
And what community do you currently live in?
Westboro, Massachusetts.
Your marital status?
I'm widowed.
And do you have children?
I have 2 children and 6 grandchildren.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about life in New York City growing up.
Life in New York City was good. I can't complain. Used the subway a lot to get around. And socioeconomic situation was very normal to me. Strictly middle class, and we all got along very nicely.
And what did your father do for a living?
My father was a CPA.
And your mom?
School teacher.
And I understand you had a couple of relatives who took part in
I
World War II.
had 2 uncles who served in the Army in World War II. Yep.
Okay. So when did you graduate?
From
high school.
high school, 1963.
Did you go to college after?
I did. I went to St. John's University, the same university my father attended.
And what was your major?
My major it started as accounting, and it ended up being management.
Did you graduate from St. John's?
I did.
So when and where did you enter the military?
Well, I actually entered the military in my sophomore year at college. I was connected to the Marine Corps Platoon Leaders Class program, and I went to Officer Candidate School between my junior and senior year, 10 weeks. Our class started with 54 and graduated 28 out of that class. Then when I graduated in June of '67, I was commissioned and went off to the basic school at Quantico, Virginia.
And tell us what basic was like.
Well, Officer Candidate School was like a typical boot camp, a little more on the cerebral side, but very physical, very regimented, obviously. In many cases, you were sorely tested, both physically and emotionally, which, in retrospect, was a great experience, but going through it was, as most will tell you, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And you're going into OCS in 1967. Tell us a little bit about the times.
Well, the 60s were not an easy time, as you know. When I went into OCS, PLC program, the Vietnam War was just starting to heat up. There weren't as many protests at that point, but a few months later, when I got back at the end of the summer, things really got kind of nasty. And in fact, we marched in a pro-war parade. And, you know, it was a little different than it is now. I won't say it wasn't uncivil at times, but it was a difficult period. The country was divided. A lot of people had questions. I had a cousin who had seriously thought about going to Canada. And I said to him, if you go to Canada, I'm coming to get you. Half jokingly, he never went to Canada, but I don't think what I said had any influence on it. But it was a difficult time. I mean, anybody who's lived through the 60s understands, especially in a big city.
Okay. Well, Michael, let's get you back to OCS.
Yes.
How long was the course?
Well, this particular program, you could either do 6 weeks between your freshman and sophomore year, your sophomore and junior year, and 6 weeks junior and senior year. But I chose to do the 10 weeks during my junior and senior year. So I arrived in June, and 10 weeks later, I was done and back to school, get myself ready. There was no doubt where we were going to end up. We knew we had to go back to Quantico for 5 more months for officers' basic school, and then on to Vietnam. That was pretty clear. Although in my case, that trip was there was a humorous side to it, if there can be. So I finished basic school, and it was a little tumultuous because my wife and I were supposed to get married on December 4th, 1 week after, or 2 weeks after I finished basic school. And the Marine Corps said to me, your orders are sending you to North Carolina. You have to be there on December 4th. So either don't get married or change the date. So we changed it at the last minute to 2 days, the weekend before Thanksgiving. And we got married and we drove to North Carolina. And I spent the next 3 months at Camp Lejeune learning logistics. That was my assigned specialty. But every Marine's a rifleman, no matter what rank. And so I can tell you that, yes, every Marine is a rifleman. And then got my orders, official orders to go to Vietnam, went home for 30 days leave. And at that time, because I was an individual, I wasn't traveling with a group. I traveled individually on my own. And at every stop on my way to Vietnam, I would check in and show my orders, and they would say, well, you're not on the flight manifest. And I said, well, here are my orders. So California, Hawaii, I finally got to Okinawa, which is kind of the way station. And I checked in, and some grizzled old gunnery sergeant, he was probably in his early 30s when you look back, said, sorry, Lieutenant, I have nothing on you. Go to the BOQ, check in, come back in 3 or 4 days, maybe get your shots. And so I did, showed up 3 or 4 days later. I think it was 3 days later, and he said to me, oh yeah, Lieutenant Barretti. He said, your orders were canceled. Nobody knows what you're doing here. You're supposed to be in the Mediterranean on a ship. And he said, I guess your new orders never caught up with you. Duh, So I said, okay, what are you going to do? You sending me back? He said, oh, no. Headquarters Marine Corps said, since you're there, keep on going. So I showed up in Vietnam the next day and checked in, and they said, we don't know what to do with you. So hang on a minute. Come back tomorrow. They got me into some sleeping quarters, and I went back that night. There was a firefight not too far from me, which was interesting because we were unarmed. There were 3 of us in the building. And went back the next day, and they said, you're going to such and such, and it's 3rd 155 self-propelled artillery battery, and you're going to be the logistics officer. I said, okay, fine. So they got me a ride over, which was interesting because I had nothing except a helmet. And I arrived, and the battery commander said, I don't know what you're doing here. He said, my logistics officer doesn't leave for a few months. And he said, okay, I got a job for you. He said, how's your map reading? And I said, my map reading's okay. He said, okay, you're running the security platoon and doing other SLDOs. That's what you are. And I won't tell you what the S stands for, but little details officer is the rest. Okay. Well, it was all right, you know, and it wasn't, things were kind of quiet, so I got about a week to break in and get to know things and get to meet people, get to understand what was what, and then that's what I did for a few months.
Okay, and where exactly in Vietnam were you?
So we were southwest of Da Nang, and the area was called the Arizona Territory. It had a very bad reputation. We were really at the top of the territory, and we would provide artillery support for any operations in that area. We had one of our gun platoons was down in a place called An Hoa, which was a small city south of just at the southern part of the Arizona Territory. So occasionally I would have to go back and forth either by helicopter or in a convoy, which always proved interesting because at one point we got ambushed, and, you know, it is what it is. But we were well prepared and ready to go.
So they gave you more than a helmet.
Yeah, eventually I got, you know, my flak jacket and my personal weapon and, you know, a rifle if I needed one. But it was, I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is 90% of the time there was a lot of boredom. The other 10%, you know, let's just say you had a heightened anxiety. But I took it as again, retrospectively, a great learning opportunity and character building opportunity. You know, didn't think about it when I was going through it. But, you know, there were some difficult times and there were some very humorous times. So, is what it is.
Okay, you remember any of either?
I remember one of our guns blew up once and killed 2 of our people in a very grisly and ghastly manner. I didn't like that. I remember one of the recon teams coming back by helicopter, and as we looked up, there were 2 bodies hanging from the skids of the helicopter. They were Vietnamese. They were bad guys. And then I remember one Sunday sunbathing. It was a slow, quiet day, and I was sunbathing behind my tent, and there was a rifle shot, and the bullet impacted over my head, and, you know, kind of woke me up, so to speak. And then about a minute later, there was another one, and it impacted in the same place. And I said, okay, somebody's shooting at me. And that created a lot of stir, and I threw my helmet on and stuck my feet in my boots and ran buck naked across the compound, which, you know, created a little bit of a laugh. Everybody got a giggle out of it. But I mean, those are the couple of things that stand in my mind. Being chased by a water buffalo was another. You know, those are the things that happen.
Okay, so Michael, how long were you stationed in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam, had a 13-month tour, and at the end of 11 months, for just about the end of 11 months, I was injured, and the confluence of events was that I was injured. My wife had just had our first child a couple of months before, and my father-in-law had died the month before I was injured. So I didn't know this until I went on R&R and I was able to call home. And she got in touch with the Red Cross, and I got back from R&R, and they said, don't bother unpacking, here's your new orders. Going home. So, you know, it was at once a shock, but at the same time a huge relief. You know, everybody looks for rotation time, rotation day, and you keep a short timer's calendar and all that stuff. So, it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. So you went home after.
Well, what was really in the period in between while I was still in Vietnam, I got a new set of orders. So when I finished my normal tour, I was supposed to go to the Mediterranean. So I said to my CO, listen, this is, getting to be a real mess up here. And he said, let me see what I could do. So he reached out, and over a period of a couple of weeks, we did some back and forth with Washington. And they said, okay, if you will extend your active duty time for 1 year, we'll give you any assignment you want. I said, okay, I want to go to New York City. And they said, okay. And my last 2.5 years on active duty was as the logistics officer at the 1st Marine Corps headquarters in Garden City, New York, which is out on Long Island. And I spent a very enjoyable time, 45 minutes away from family in the Bronx. My child grew up in, it was military housing, but it was nice. So her first 3 years were very enjoyable. What else can I say?
Of course, you're in the Marine Corps when Vietnam
Yes.
became more and more prominent.
Yeah. Well, Marine Corps was very interesting at the time, too. They made it clear that at that time, every 3 years, you were going to be rotated overseas, unaccompanied, which meant no family. And, you accept that. I accepted it. I didn't plan on staying an extra year on active duty, but I did. And as it turned out, it was a life-changing experience. Again, looking back, it was one of the things that got me up here. So I was getting ready to transition out, and I started applying for jobs. And one of the companies that expressed an interest in me was a little old camera company called Polaroid. And the job was actually in New Jersey. And so I went and did an interview. And 2 weeks later, they said, okay, we'd like you to go up to Cambridge, Needham, and have a second interview. So I was still on active duty. So I arranged to inspect the Reserve and Recruiting Center up here, and had to wear a uniform, of course. And then once I finished there, I got in a taxi, went to Needham, walked into the general manager's office, and he took one look at me and he said, when do you want to start? And it turned out he was a retired Army colonel, and he had Korean War experience. So we got along very well. And I was supposed to move to Texas. And at the last minute, they said, we'd like you to move to California. So we moved to California. And at that point, I joined the 23rd Marines, which was a reserve infantry unit. And I was a captain at the time. And I ended up in California for a year. So I got a year with that reserve unit. And then they decided to move me back to New Jersey. So I moved back in, with Polaroid at the time, you either moved or died on the vine, right? So I moved back to New Jersey, joined a Marine Corps unit in Fort Schuyler, New York, a reserve unit, which was not far from where I grew up. And then a year later, they said, well, we'd like you to go to Massachusetts for a year's worth of corporate experience. That was in 1974. And they said, don't sell your house. Just I said, okay. So up we came, and let's just put it this way, it's been a very long year. Okay. So that was my trip, and then, that was the way I got here, I guess. And I joined the 25th Marines out of Worcester, and they're another infantry unit, and spent the balance of my Marine Corps service with that unit, and retired in 1987 as a major. So the Marine Corps had a very big impact on my life. I mean, I can count on one hand the character building times in my life, and that absolutely was one of them. So.
So let's go back to serving in the military in the 1970s. I know you've been in the reserves by that time.
Yes.
But I'm sure you were witness to some very interesting changes as Vietnam became post-Vietnam.
Yes.
And you're going into more technical changes in uniform.
Well,
Take it away.
okay. So let's start with the big picture. The focus shifted. What they learned from Vietnam, and learned very quickly, because Vietnam, during that period we drafted a lot of people, and it created a lot of issues. Vietnam didn't have the same patriotic fervor that you had in World War II or even in World War I, or I would say even in Korea. People, there were issues that we had to deal with. I went back to Vietnam, by the way, in 2007. I can tell you that one. But anyway, so two things happened which were kind of significant. One, the focus started to be on Russia and how the United States and NATO was going to deal with the Russian threat as it was at that point perceived. And secondly, we were going to be a more professional military, and the reserves were going to augment a smaller professional force. And so all of our training, I shouldn't say all, pretty much all of our training was with the active forces. So we did a lot of exercises. You do your 2 weeks every summer, and then officers are required to go to at least one school during the summer. So 2 weeks turns into 4 weeks. But that's okay. But we did a number of exercises. One big one was in Europe with the NATO forces. So I served as, by that time I was, and this was getting toward the end of the 70s, I was a major. And I was an umpire for that exercise. So I worked with the Royal Marines, I worked with the German Army, I worked with the Danish Army, learned a lot. I guess they would talk about it today as being kind of intersectional activities. It was, or integrated activities. It was an eye-opener, but the focus was clearly on Russia. And, that persisted right up until the time I retired. The 25th Marines, because of the Russian threat, was designated as the cold weather regiment for the Marine Corps. So we did a lot of training in cold weather climates, including Minnesota in the winter. Yeah, it was cold. Living in a snow hut and all of that stuff, not fun. But that's the way it was supposed to be. And, as the war plan at the time designated, if the so-called balloon went up with Russia, our regiment was headed right for Scandinavia. So right up into that area of Finland and Sweden and Norway. and we ran some exercises up there, and they were pretty interesting. And then our technology improved. The Marine Corps is very much a functionally integrated organization, and it's an air-ground task force. We could, I will quote a recent commandant. We could be invited into a country, we could pick the lock to get into a country, or we could kick the door down. That was our job. And we could go with all of our own organic equipment and be self-sustaining for 30 to 60 days, which at that point, obviously reinforcements involved. But it was an interesting time, and I learned a lot, and I met a lot of people who ended up becoming senior leaders in the Marine Corps as time went on.
Mm-hmm. So let's get back to the years after you retired from the Marine Corps.
Okay.
Did you continue to work for Polaroid?
No, I actually left Polaroid in 1976, 2 years after I arrived in Massachusetts, because they said my next assignment was either going to be in manufacturing or sales, and I wasn't interested in either. And I migrated into healthcare, and I was a hospital administrator, a director of logistics and what they called material services at Faulkner Hospital in Jamaica Plain, and at Newton Wellesley Hospital, and then was hired as the CEO of a healthcare services corporation. I spent 7 years with that organization, and then moved on to, four of us got together and founded our own international healthcare marketing management firm, and we did that for about 10 years, and then sold that company. And then I had, in the interim, while I was working in fact it was at Faulkner Hospital, I started my graduate degree, my MBA, at Suffolk University. And in 1996, the director of that program called me and said, "Could you cover a class?" And I said, "What's the subject?" And it was marketing, so it was pretty easy. And I said, "Sure," and I did it, and got a call the next day, said, "Hey, the students really liked you. Would you be interested in doing a full course next semester?" I said I would, as long as it's at night, because I had already gotten involved in another business. And I did that, and in the process I was approached by the chair of the marketing department, said, "Would you consider being executive in residence, which is a full-time job?" I said, "As long as my courses were held at night." So we struck a bargain. I became executive in residence for 2 years. In the interim, sold the company that I was with, and became a full-time faculty member a year later. And I retired from Suffolk in 2017. So I spent, all told, 20 years. And it was great. Mm-hmm. It was great. And it's one of my favorite times in life. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got back to Vietnam in 2007. Mm-hmm. So one piece of our program was, obviously we were focused on global business at the time, was to take students abroad so they could understand what was going on with the global business community from a different perspective. And the Southeast Asian area was very hot. They called them the Tigers, and there were a couple of other names. So I got what I thought was a bright idea, and I said, let's take a group to Vietnam. By then I was the director of the executive MBA program. And so we took a group, and I brought my wife along. I wanted her to see where I was, and we went to Saigon, where I had never been. And we were treated, I in particular, when the people in now Ho Chi Minh City knew that I was there during the war, I was treated royally. I couldn't believe how well I was treated. Now, it's a communist country, but we came to learn, and it's still the same way, that the southern part of the country is where a lot of the business gets driven from. So as long as you're not committing any crimes or speaking against the government, you're okay. And then we flew from Ho Chi Minh City to Da Nang, which I was much more familiar with. I tried to figure out a way to get back to where I was, because it was only 20 miles outside the city. And I couldn't. I had no maps. The terrain changed. So never got there, but got to a few other places. And the irony was that a lot of the students, and they were older students, they kind of kept looking at me during the trip, and they expressed their concern that I was going to have, I don't know, some kind of flashback or something, and I didn't. Although I will tell you that when we arrived at the airport in Da Nang, the reception area was as it was when I left in 1968, January 69 I left. And it was exactly the same. There were just some posters on the wall, tourist posters. We managed to get some driving around done. We went to China Beach, where we used to get in country R&R. There were some beautiful resorts, one of which we stayed at. And the old R&R Center was still there. We went past the helicopter facility at Marble Mountain. The Quonset huts were still there. The taxiways were still there, and they were full of weeds, and there was a fence around the place. Hadn't changed, not one bit. It wasn't being used, but that was kind of, brings back memories, but they were all okay, no complaints.
So, Michael,
Yeah.
I understand you did earn several medals and/or commendations.
Yes, I did. My injury put me in a position to be awarded the Purple Heart.
Mm-hmm.
And then I earned a Navy Achievement Medal and a Combat Action Ribbon. I mean, if you're there and you get involved, we used to get rocketed regularly. So, there were people who did far much more than I did. Some, as we say, who gave all, and all gave some, including some of my very close friends. My roommate from basic school was killed in action. My neighbor, when we were living in North Carolina, was a helicopter pilot. He was killed in action. So it's an unfortunate part of the way life was at the time.
Mm-hmm. And after your service, did you join any veteran service organizations?
No, I didn't. I didn't join either the American Legion or the VFW. I don't know. I think I maybe needed a break, but I now serve on the Veterans Advisory Board in Westboro.
And tell us a little more about that.
Well, that board in particular is designed to assist and get assistance for veterans residing in Westboro, and currently there are 550, and also to recognize them through various activities. So we're responsible for the Memorial Day Parade, for Veterans Day. We plant flags on the Rotary and in the cemeteries on special occasions. We have a Quilt of Valor program. We have Hometown Heroes program. So all of our veterans who choose to participate have their picture around town for everybody to see. I mean, it's we do a lot of things in the background too. And it's a group of really dedicated guys and ladies. Sorry. Times have changed, and I recognize that. In fact, our secretary is a Westboro police officer, and she and I are going to be doing a little work together now on this upcoming Veterans Day thing. But it's dedicated to the folks who have served this country. It's not original with me, but there's an expression that, or a saying that a veteran has written a blank check to the U.S. government, payable at any time and in any amount up to and including their lives. So, that's what they've done. And personally, not being self-serving, but just thinking about them, they deserve to be recognized and honored because, I remember people who would come up to me and say, well, I almost joined the Marine Corps. Well, first of all, you don't join the Marine Corps. You earn it. And secondly, my response would be to myself, it's not because I could and you couldn't. It's because I did and you didn't. So there's a camaraderie around being in the military. People understand, especially folks that served in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. When you meet someone else who did, it's kind of like you chewed the same dirt. So I've stayed active with the Marine Corps as well. I'm involved in the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation. And then, of course, every year the Marine Corps does a big birthday luncheon in Boston, and I always attend that. So that's it.
Okay.
Nothing else.
Well, Michael Barretti, we thank you so much for taking part in the Natick Veterans Oral History Project.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.